Hey everyone, I'm excited to bring to you my dear friend Jackie Shao. We have a bi-weekly accountability calls, so it's always nice to connect with Jackie. And uh, funny story actually, Jackie and I met like way back in when was that? Like 2 years ago? No more, right?
Probably 2016. I'm just throwing a date out there.
Been a while, but we met like a long time ago, and it's interesting how the world of professional development works. But when we first met, I think we were like, "Oh, hey, what's up?" But I guess we didn't like connect like that at that time. And then when we re-engaged, we were on the phone for like an hour and a half or something like that.
It's true. I remember the first time we met and how there wasn't much of a connection. And it's always surprising how, like, as long as you keep in touch with people, like, how you can build that connection.
Yeah. Yeah, and then I'll never forget like when I saw you in Columbus, Ohio for the Summit of Greatness. We like looked at each other like that was like one of the most fun like screams or yells or whatever noise we made when we saw each other.
I did scream across the room, Davidson!
We were like, of course you would be here. Uh,
True.
good times, good times. Well, yeah, well, I'm excited to bring you on my podcast. You know, like one of the big reasons, I mean, you do so many amazing, cool things, but it we had some pretty deep conversations about what you went through recently with COVID. So I thought it would be interesting to share with people like sort of your experience. And yeah, I feel like, man, I don't know, I'll let you kind of give context as to what I'm talking about.
Sure. So I guess I wanted to start by saying that I am a very, very careful person, or I like to think I am, anyways, right? So before coronavirus came to New York, as far as we know, um, I was already preparing for it based on what was going on around the world. And I had a feeling that it was going to come here. Um, and I mean, I clean everything. I actually traveled right before coronavirus really hit New York City. And I remember being on the plane. Is that going to be a problem? The horns outside my window.
Yeah, that's how you know you're in New York City. Yeah.
That is, I am Queens all the way. um, so essentially, even like going on the planes and everything, I was like cleaning everything around me, like being very careful, wearing masks. And this is before anybody said that we had to wear masks. So even with being so careful, about a month ago, I believe I came down with what is the coronavirus. So I was sick for very, very sick for about 2 weeks. And I'm still recovering right now. I'm on the up and up. But there's still some things that like are holding on, such as, dizziness and some like chest tightness and stuff, and some exhaustion that I'm working around and working with right now. But through that entire experience of COVID, well, I'll be honest, I was really, really angry. um, I was really angry and I felt like a victim completely. I mean, I felt like I did everything that I could have done, quote unquote, right. And yet I still got it. It put me in a mind space that was not great, to be honest. Any thoughts I had about blaming the world, or even being angry at the people that I can hear from my window outside, um, like all of those thoughts were like in my head. So I wasn't in the best space, definitely when I was very sick. Um, and at the same time, it was the time that I couldn't really do anything else. So all I had was my thoughts, right? I can only sit there and think. Um, And I guess it's true when they say in New York City, like, we're all so busy. We always like do all these different things so that we don't really have time to sit with our thoughts so much. And even I'm a coach. And I'm totally into self-development. I'm totally into always like looking at myself in many, many different ways. But this experience going through COVID, I felt like I was looking through a completely different lens than I ever have before.
Yeah, I mean that's like a pretty loaded topic. Like just like being able to sit with ourselves and obviously like you were forced to sit with yourself and even way worse conditions. But yeah, would you be able to elaborate some of those thoughts that were going? I know we discussed it briefly, but if you're open to sharing, like what came up for you.
Yeah, I mean, almost everything as far as when it came to like my anger, right? I thought a lot about like racism in this country, especially being an Asian American at this time. I thought a lot about how people can have different beliefs on something that is factual. Um, and I felt like overall there was a lot of judgment from me towards others. And I think it made me think a lot about like how really it wasn't about my judgment about others. It really was about my judgment of myself. Um, and on, I don't want to say the other side of things, but like when like you go through stages, right? There's always like um, the true anger and grief and all of that. And then you come into like acceptance in some ways. And I felt like that was happening for me and it has been continually happening for me. Um, I would say that like this entire time I was like fighting myself. I was really bummed that there wasn't anything I could do. Like I'm running a business and I can't even work on my business. Um, and one day I just like woke up and kind of let go of all of that, the anger, the judgments, because I realized I was fighting so hard, but the only person that was getting exhausted really was me. Like I was fighting myself. I wasn't really fighting anybody on the outside. I definitely wasn't doing anything positive for people around me. So it's like the only person I was really hurting was myself um, through that. And so I started to really just allow for space, I guess, space to think and allow myself to have whatever judgments and angry thoughts I had and sad thoughts come up and just kind of like observe them and not put anything on them, not make them really mean anything and not make them mean anything about me as a person. Um,
Huh. Do you think like because I think like New Yorkers in general are like attract like a certain like hustle mentality, like, oh, I gotta create, I gotta be hustling, I gotta be grind.
mm,
That's kind of like the New York mentality. So I do think a lot of stuff is coming up. Like even for me, I feel like a lot of the judgments I have around like, oh, I need to like work out, or like I'm very judgmental against people who like don't do yoga or like meditation or workout and stuff like that. I'm like, but it's like it doesn't make sense, right? Because it's like if I'm supposed to be this motivational guy, like why am I disempowering people? You know what I mean? Or just being judgmental. So I also notice like a lot has like come up for me too around like the way I judge myself. Like, oh man, like because I'm not running 10, 15 miles every day, like I'm beating myself up about it. But it's interesting to see what comes up during this time.
Yeah, I'm so glad you just said that because it's true. It's like we're in fields where we're there to uplift people, you know? So on top of all the judgments and everything, another judgment is like, oh wow, I'm supposed to be this person. I'm supposed to be.
Yeah.
This is what I'm supposed to do, right? And like being in that mind space, I mean,
First, yeah.
it just it's just like hating on yourself harder in some ways.
No, it's a good point. So yeah, I went through that stage and then I'm like, you know what? Like, I'm not perfect, right? And then, luckily like I have a therapist, and the therapist helps me realize like, yeah, you know, I mean, it's basically if I'm like judging this hard on people like not like being productive during this time, like man, like of course I'm gonna be hard on myself, you know, because like you said, it starts with ourselves, and then whatever we judge about other people, we're probably gonna judge about ourselves like in the same way. So
Yeah.
it's interesting how that works.
It's almost easier blaming everything outside of yourself, but
Yeah.
if you really look, it probably comes from right there, right inside.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's hard for anyone to admit, right? Like when I'm like being harsh with my fiance, like I don't want to be, right? But that means like if I'm that hard about like whatever it is, like I'm probably harder on myself, right? That's just how it works. So yeah. Whew. Already
Yeah.
straight into it.
Going straight into it. There was something that you said about like hustling and being in New York and knowing that like that's the thing that's being taught to us, right? Being a New Yorker, that you have to hustle and everything. There's a piece of that too in all of us. It's like hustling, I feel like does I guess my question is, does hustle have to be hard? You know,
Yeah.
and that came out of this because the whole time I'm like, wow, I'm really struggling through. Like everything is a fight. Everything is like a battle. It's never like, oh, it just is.
Hmm.
Um, until I let it be, right? Um, so I'm curious to hear what you have to say about like hustling and like struggling and
I feel like that's like the $1 million question. I think you're completely right. I think New York has a way of being that's like, oh, you have to like, you kind of have to force it, right? It's like, oh, well, I'm gonna keep asking them until they say yes. But I don't necessarily think that's like the best way to live life. Like it leads to burnout and exhaustion. And I think most New Yorkers can. I think that's why people move out of New York because you know it's like, oh, I can actually breathe now. You know, I mean, I know like my fiance is like very like she you know she likes getting out in New York because she's like, oh, you know, I can like kind of like I feel because even when she walks around New York, she's like, oh, people walk so slow here, and I'm like, dude, like it's not that big of a deal. Like it's fine. Like what's it's not like we have anywhere to be, you know. Um, but yeah, that's a good point. I've been battling with this, I think, my whole life, but I do think there's some people do it with grace. Like I'm sure you can think of certain people that just seem like, yeah, I mean, honestly, like from the outside though, it doesn't seem like it seems like you're pretty like calm. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't seem like you're like forcing things. I don't know. That's what
mm.
it seems like from my perspective.
Well, right now I am. You know, I'm definitely talking about like what I've been through in the 2 weeks and then
Okay.
right after coming back in and everything. Like I said, I think I just one day decided that I was going to allow for things, like really let it all be okay. Like wherever I was, however sad I was or upset about something, like it's okay. Like we're going through stuff collectively right now, right?
Uh,
It's all about uncertainty. And in some ways, I related that to just like life in general. Like life is uncertain.
mm,
And I can continue to fight my way through it or just give myself some time and space
mm,
so that I can really tap into what's important to me and tap into the person that I see myself as instead of this angry, judgmental, you know, persona that I took on for a little bit.
mm. That's awesome that you give. So it seems like you're even seeing the silver lining in obviously a horrible experience, but you're seeing that like actually like it made you kind of reflect on um you know maybe there's another way to go about this and just in general. And I'm sure it sounds like you'll take this even you know when things quote unquote go back to normal if it does.
Yeah, I think it's a great reminder. It's a solid thing that I can grasp onto. And it's not to say that like there's not going to be hard times coming or difficult things I have to deal with, but I think there has been a shift in me knowing that like, sure, I may not have control over every single thing around me, but what I do have is like being able to just be like in the moment, and I will be able to come out of it, you know? And I think that's the thing about process. Like I really was thinking about how not just me, but I see it in my clients, I see it with people around me that like we want to get from point A to point B so quickly. I personally would love to jump. I just want to like, I'm like, I think of an idea, that's my starting point, and I want it to be created already. And like the whole process of doing it is actually the thing, you know? But I would love to skip over it sometimes. And I think coronavirus and just this time around it made me realize that I can't just skip every single thing. Like I was sick, and day to day, I had to, minute to minute, I had to deal with what was right in front of me because there was nothing else that I could do. You know, I was so sick, I couldn't even get out of bed most days. And it's like, I just wanted to be well. And no, like I was actually living day to day just by being sick, you know, and sometimes. So it was an interesting thought that came out of all of this as well.
Hmm. You mentioned about like I feel like you said control, like you can't
Mm,
like control it, because I do think there's like, because there's I think successful people like want to control like a lot of outcomes, right? Because I think like that
sure.
leads, that's why they're successful a lot of times, because whether it's like attention to detail or it's like you know, like striving for excellence, right? So I guess where do you find that balance of so it sounds like you're more talking about like respecting the process, right? But then I feel like you still need some control, right? Like you still want it to be like, because I think art and like people that are creative in general like the control, because then they can make it like they can design something like brilliant versus kind of like, oh, we'll figure it out, like, you know what I mean? Like I feel like where do you find that balance of like just letting it flow and just like it'll just happen versus like, okay, well, it's gonna be perfect.
Truth of the matter is, nothing's ever really going to be perfect. Especially if, you know, if someone's like judgmental already, like even if something is perfect, you won't even see it, right? So I don't know if there's like a balance. There's like understanding that there is this need for control to be successful. But for me, I think it's like, it's that understanding plus just really allowing things to flow. I talk about flow a lot because in my background as a creative, like that's when I felt the most creative. That's when I actually created, when I was in flow. And being in flow, there is nothing to control. Like whatever comes out, and you just allow it to happen. And you can go back on whatever you create and like tweak it and change it and all of that. But in the moment of flow, it just feels like you're just there. You're actually being who you are, and there's only that moment, and there's not really anything else that you need to think about, and you don't think about anything else. So I think there's a lot of beauty when it comes to like being in flow and like the creative process.
That's deep, but how does one get out of our heads and just into a state of being? Because I feel like in theory it makes sense, but it's probably a little bit harder to be in that constant state of flow all the time, you know?
Yeah, and I don't know if the goal is to be in the constant state of flow all the time, because obviously we live in a world where there's concrete things that we need to do,
Uh,
and like we need to feed ourselves, we need to like make money, all of that stuff. So so it's not about like being in that state of flow all the time, but being able to like tap into it, and not whenever you can, but like um it's like a practice. It's like everything else, you know, you work on something over and over again. Some days, right? Like I like to take the example of yoga, for example. Some days, if I practice it every day, like sometimes I can stretch my arms longer. right? And then the next day, all of a sudden, I'm like falling over and everything hurts. And through that process, it's not about like being mad at myself in the moment, right? Maybe those feelings can come up, but like to stay there and to blame myself for what my body can or cannot do in that moment is in some ways not productive and maybe even a little silly. And I think the same thing comes for like creativity. It's a practice. It's like a muscle that you have to work on every single day. Sometimes it comes very naturally and actually quote unquote flows. And other days it's stagnant and it's painful and it may not come as well. So
But
um,
like things that I guess are there like tips to help people if they want to get into a more creative sense of flow? I guess like I'm sure if it was that easy, I'm sure there's no like magic formula. Maybe what are some of the things that help you get into that when you do need to be, put on your like creative hat or something like that?
um, I do a lot of silly things, but maybe there's a theme through it that we can discover together.
Okay.
I think one of the things that when I think about is I take myself out of what I usually do.
Hmm.
So if I'm usually in front of a computer, or I'm usually, sitting down in a certain seat or something, I change locations or environments.
Hmm.
I make myself very, very comfortable. Um, and I have everything ready around me. So whether I need a notebook or markers or, paint, whatever it may be, like the supplies are there for me to use. And that day I can choose what medium I want to use. I jump around a lot. Sometimes to get myself to shift from one mode to another, I do a little dance. I like drink some water. I really just like I have like some rituals that take me from point A to point B that, you know, um, I even walk when I was allowed to walk outside. I used to take a lot of walks outside. Um, I find that like either being close to nature or even looking at other people's creations really helps me like feel creative even, right? Um, and then I get down to it. I have to say the first moment is always the hardest. The first moment I put a pen to paper or I'm designing something on the computer, it's always like that moment that you can hesitate and think too much about it and not want to
Hmm.
do it anymore.
Yeah.
So sometimes I'll just draw random lines. Like if I have uh, like a charcoal and big pads of paper, I'll just draw lines and see how straight I can make those lines,
Huh.
just to get myself messy and just to
Mm.
let it come out of me. Right? It's almost like a way of like clearing it all out and stuff. And then whenever I'm ready, I start creating, and that could look many different ways. And again, I just don't really judge myself on like if it's going to be perfect because to be honest, more likely than not, it's going to look really messy and terrible. And I just put down all of my ideas.
Yeah, to that point, I'm curious as do you think when one, because it seems like, I don't know if this is a common trend or maybe it's just movies and media, but it seems like the most creative people often battle with like a lot of internal like dialogue, right? And then I feel like sometimes that whatever that adversity is helps them create more creative types of works of art. I don't know, unless like maybe I'm making this up, but that's what it seems like in my mind.
That's so funny. I think there's a little truth to everything, right? Every single person's process and every single person is different. Every single creative person is different.
Mm.
Um, and this is probably a good time for me to say that I believe that everyone can be creative. So there's that. But I think it's different for every single person. But I think it relates to what I was just talking about before, like my experience through COVID and everything.
Mhm.
Like yeah, sometimes I'm like totally resistant to like putting the pen down on the paper, for example, to write something. Like totally resistant and not wanting to do it. And then having all of this internal dialogue and and telling myself I can't do this or that doesn't seem right or whatever. Sure, that can happen and everything. Um, but I think eventually it's like what you really, really want, right? Like if your goal is to create something, then you're going to do it eventually. It may not be exactly on that day. Maybe the stuff that maybe in that moment, all you can do is sit down in front of a notebook and stare at a blank piece of paper, right? And maybe that's all you need for that day. And then the next day, maybe you can allow yourself to draw something, maybe, right? So I don't know if there's any hard and fast rules about it, but I do believe that like when you go through something, there is more depth or more meat to what you are about to create, for sure. Like I know going through COVID, anytime you go through some sort of struggle or anything that seems difficult to you, um, there's going to be ideas that come out of that and ideas that you probably want to explore. Um, and ideas that you might not want to explore because you're not being that brave. So it's a mixture.
Huh. Interesting. I feel like a lot of, so you know, I went to next level training, which is, I feel like one of the big themes that came up during it was that to our first point, like people are usually like, there's stuff that people like were gonna wanted to deal with, but then they're dealing with now because like they're forced to kind of just be alone and be with their thoughts. I guess like how does one deal with it earlier instead of waiting until like a crisis or something like this? Like, I'm like, I don't want that to happen because that just sounds horrible, you know? Like how can we like deal with it in real time or like, you know what I mean? Like in a healthier way.
From that question, I'm hearing like there doesn't need to be like a crisis or something going wrong for you to like look at yourself,
Right.
right? And again, I think it depends on each person because I also have struggled with this too. Like sometimes in my past, I have let crises happen, or maybe I created things through sabotage to make something bigger than it is before I can actually really deal with it. And I think, I mean, like you said, it's not really easy, right?
Yeah.
But maybe it can be. Like I have had that thought recently that maybe none of this has to be so hard. Um,
I'm hearing
to, what was that?
hearing a common theme between us.
Yeah. There's some new ideas always in there.
Your life's purpose again?
My life's purpose. Ah, brilliance.
That's your life's purpose?
Yeah.
Oh. So that I hear like creation in that. Is that
Yeah, it's like just being able to radiate out and touch as many people as possible. And then they, in turn, are also touching my life and what I'm doing.
so it's
Um,
like inspiration, sort of.
Inspiration, connectedness, I would say.
Interesting. That's cool. Okay. So with that in mind, I guess like what are you looking to create like now that you know you that's like a loaded question. Yeah, I guess like I mean because that's like a pretty big like life's purpose, you know?
Yeah. Well, I'll talk about what I want to create immediately, which is health. Like I'm working on my health these days. I'm really setting up some scaffolding around it so that like I even on easy things or simple things, maybe not easy things, but simple things like eating um, and resting and knowing what times I'm most alert and ready to do some work and everything, and allowing for my body to come back to things before I add in more things. So immediately I'm creating health.
Yeah.
Um, And then secondarily, like for the future and like my bigger vision of what I'm creating, I'd like to say a creative community, like just a community full of amazingly smart people who want to constantly create in their own lives, who constantly want to shift things for themselves, who allow themselves to be angry and sad and all of those things that you feel, but also want to move and touch other people and inspire other people based on what they're creating.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And it's interesting, like just reflecting on, like, I guess even since we started doing our bi-weekly like meetings, like I feel like I've actually created a lot. And I'm sure it's like not a coincidence that, you know, we've been supporting each other, right? But my podcast and my like my book and like my blog has been like really like I guess like where I channel my creativity. But it's interesting because yeah, I mean clearly you're doing that already, so that's awesome.
I hope so. I believe so.
Curious as to like what made you want to do this program, the accomplishment coaching program, and then what made you take next step and even take on additional as you're doing like the second program.
Within accomplishment coaching.
Yeah.
So it's a fairly, I'll make it short. I was like, it's a fairly long story, but I'll try to keep it short and sweet. Essentially, about 5 years ago, I burnt out from work, from life, from everything. I felt like I was starting to feel very toxic, and some of that toxic energy was starting to creep into other people and other parts of my life, and seeing that made me very, very upset. So I opted from there to have a year sabbatical. And during that time, I like learned things. I traveled. I learned how to swim during that time. That's when I started yoga. I was working at a tea shop as an apprentice to learn more about tea. And I think the first inkling that something was happening was like at the tea house. I remember a lot of people would come in and we would talk tea all day, every day, which was really fun. But because people were staying for such long periods of time, eventually the conversations would always turn to life. And since I was going through a life transition myself, it like really piqued my interest of how that environment created space for people to talk about different things in their lives. And it was like the first seed planted that I wanted a tea house, a space for people to come to that were going through their own life transitions, and for us to figure things out together and have a community around that, you know, as people grew from one transition to another.
Yeah.
And obviously we're in New York City, so space is expensive. Physical space is actually very expensive. So I started concentrating really much on the back, like the programs I want to run for that to happen, instead of like the physical space and the physical tea house. And eventually I was running something called Social Tea House out of different co-working spaces. It was a program that I would bring once a month essentially, and every month there would be another a new topic, something around life that and I would bring people, mostly creatives and social entrepreneurs, together to discuss that topic, because my idea was that like creatives and social entrepreneurs in general tend to not live like the 9 to 5 job, right? And also tend to be working very much alone in whatever they're trying to achieve. Like a lot of creatives are freelancers, so you know, maybe we work from coffee shops or, you know, alone in our homes or whatnot. And the same thing for entrepreneurs. You know, there's a saying of like, once you're on top, it's lonely on top. And it's like, you're the only one running your company many times, unless you're lucky enough to have like a co-founder or maybe like a board of advisors around you. But even then, you're making a lot of decisions by yourself. And so your world in that sense is all taken up by work, right? And there's no time, a lot of time anyways, dedicated to other aspects of your life. And so I wanted to bring Social Tea House to people so that they can discuss those aspects of their lives, any transitions that they're going through, whether they're becoming new parents or, you know, I was starting off with very easy kind of topics such as like having affordable self-care or like better breaks in your day, how to have better breaks in your day. And then I was building up to like more difficult topics, and I wanted to talk about death and parenthood and burnout and loss of identity, loss of, you know, self, whatever it was. And during this time when I was running Social Tea House, people loved it. But one of the things that really bothered me was that I wasn't really sure what the impact was outside of that hour that we had together every single month. And I was in relationship with a lot of different people and always communicating about it. And eventually one day someone introduced me to a coach in accomplishment coaching. And it was always in the back of my head that like coaching, life coaching would be a thing that could help me build this in a way that I couldn't do at that moment. So I went for an observation of the coaching program and realized during that observation that like sometimes in life you just got to go through certain things instead of around it over and over again, because I think there is a general theme in my life that I like to go around certain things. Since I have so many ideas, I can only pick a few. But in that moment, I was like, oh, life coaching, that's a thing that I want to go through and see what happens at the other end of it, rather than waiting for a better time or more money or, you know, whatever to do it. So I did, and I graduated from Accomplishment Coaching's training program January of this year. And I jumped into a secondary part of it, which is kind of like grad school. It's like what I learned on steroids, or I didn't want to say drugs, but like on drugs in some ways, you know? So it's been everything. It's been challenging. It's been amazing. It's been so much learning. Yeah, so that's kind of my little story of how I got into like a coaching training program. And I have to say that like I didn't sign up for the coaching training program to become a coach. In fact, my first few months, I was convinced that like I was only there for the self-development and that was it. And as I was going through it, I realized that my deep desire has always been to like really impact people. Like I even got into graphic design versus other art mediums because I thought like, oh, I would have the biggest voice, you know, like people would be able to see lots of like campaigns plastered everywhere. And that way I can like really spread great messages and stuff. And my career didn't exactly pan out exactly that way. But with coaching, I felt that every single person I had the privilege to talk to, I got to touch in some way, and they got to go off and build their amazing brands and, you know, live their amazing lives. And so I haven't looked back since. I mean, this has been such a cool journey. And I would have never guessed it 5 years ago.
Yeah, and I'm curious, like you were, so one of the cool things, like you got to travel to the Galapagos Islands, and like, do you think if you didn't do like AC, you still would have done something like that? Because I feel like I know, you know, you get to create a lot more of these things. So I'm curious, or were you always like pretty adventurous, like even prior to like the coaching program with travels and stuff like that?
I think I was always pretty adventurous. I would say actually the moment I burnt out was probably the moment I chose to travel more.
Uh-huh.
So that was like years ago where I was just like, life is short and there is so much to learn and see and experience. And I wanted that. And I think travel is such an amazing way to get out of your own brain sometimes. You
Mm.
know, you get to see like how someone else lives, like truly lives, like how a different culture or a different even language or different foods that we eat affect us differently, how a city is built differently and how that environment affects people. I just think it's like the most fascinating thing.
Yeah, I think that's like you're clearly like an ENFP, right? I feel like a lot of community, it's like enrollment, like adventure, people, like yeah, I could totally see that.
That was the talk you had with Santa on her podcast
Yeah.
interview.
Oh wait, I never asked you, did you ever do Enneagram?
I have. I don't remember exactly what I am and what wing I am, but I have in the past. Like all of these personality tests, and they're just fascinating, right? They're just fun to read. It's fun to see yourself in some things and maybe even see other people in it. I remember the first time I got into Myers-Briggs, ended up taking the test after myself, like taking the test as like my husband, taking the test as my best friend, taking the test as my sister, just to really figure out like what it is about their personalities that make them tick and what it is about our personalities together combined that like the spaces that can use some improvement and like why someone acts a certain way. Like
Yeah, yeah.
I love it.
That's funny. So wait, how did you would try to pretend you were in their shoes and you would take it as them?
Yes, I would. So it has to be people that are very, very close to me. And a lot of times I would make them take it afterwards just to be like, oh, I got it right. Or oh, that I did not know.
So did you get the rights out of the 16? Did you get it right a lot of times?
Uh, yeah, a good number of times.
Yeah,
I would say.
that's impressive.
Yeah, thanks. Fun thing.
Yeah, it's interesting because like my fiance, she's a defender, and like
Mm.
we're campaigners, and they're like very different in a lot of different ways. Like it's like three different things, but then it's interesting because like you can see when it clashes because it's like she values like security and comfort and like you know like like a lot of these things, and then then I'm just like adventurous and meeting people and like all this stuff. So it's just interesting to see how that works. Yeah.
It definitely is. I think I might not I might ignore the other three letters more so, but like the introvert extrovert thing, I notice more and more in different people.
Uh,
Um, and I think that that's so interesting. Like just because someone's loud and social on the spot doesn't necessarily mean they're extroverted, and someone who's quiet and thoughtful doesn't necessarily mean that they're introverted. I think it's really interesting how we label people or try to box them sometimes, and it doesn't actually work.
I do think that's one of the bad things about these things because it's kind
Right.
of our comfortable way of being, but then it doesn't necessarily mean like I can't be, like quiet and you know what I mean? Like it's just like it's like the default, but doesn't necessarily mean if I practice I can get to a place where I can be whatever it is that I'm not ready.
No, I'm in total agreement with you. And I think that's what I meant by like boxing people and putting labels on people, just assuming, oh, if you're in this box, regardless of whatever label you put on it, like you are this way. Like people are so dynamic, right? We're so multi-layered and we surprise ourselves. I think this entire conversation has shown like you can surprise yourself all the time. So yeah, it's hard when I hear people like putting people in boxes and stuff. But the tests are fun. You just take them with a grain of salt, right?
I think there was another one like the Big Five. Did you ever take that one?
No.
That's like yeah, supposedly that's like the one of the more popular ones. It's called like the Big Five. Here, when I
Well,
say
now, now I'm going to take it after this conversation.
you'll know when I say it because it's like a really popular one. But it's like open. It's the Big Five stands for openness, conscientious, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism.
Oh, I don't. I actually don't know that one.
Okay, yeah, yeah, you should check that out. I think that'll be,
Totally will after this.
yeah. Cool. Well, I feel like we had like a pretty interesting conversation. A lot about some really deep stuff. Like really, I feel like we went like deep really quickly. I mean, I guess some of like the big takeaways I've gotten is just like, like figure out like figure out like your what you want to create and be intentional about what you want to create, and then find your communities that you want to like impact and influence, because I feel like you're really good about like, okay, which communities that I want to be a part of and I want to cultivate, because I think at the end of the day, the happiest people in the world are the ones that are part of communities, right? Because I think we all want a sense of like purpose and belonging, and I think the more in alignment we can be with our communities, like I think the more satisfaction we'll have in our lives. So that was one of my big takeaways. And then also to, just don't be afraid to dive deep into like self-development. Like obviously like it can be scary, but you know I feel like you grow so much and you learn so much, and you just never know where life takes you, right? I'm sure like when you were 5 you didn't know like, oh, I'm going to be a life coach, like I'm sure that's not Asian kids, like it's like you should be a life coach, you know. Yeah, and then any other anything else you would like to add onto some of the things I just mentioned?
No, I think you summed it up really well. I'm really impressed with that, actually. I'm like, I don't remember what I said this entire conversation, so I'm glad you do.
A lot. I think through every like, because it's interesting what I noticed like with a lot of life coaches, it's like something, there's like a breaking point. There's a point where like it makes you want to like help and like give back, right? I feel I never met like a life coach that was like, yeah, my life was like perfect, that's why I became a life coach, right? It's like, well, I went through this like, and then I realized, oh, okay, like there's something there, and then whatever that is triggers like an event where like, okay, like I feel like if I can help people with whatever I was struggling with, like I'd be golden. So that's something I've noticed.
No, I definitely believe that about life coaches. I want to even extend that to entrepreneurs and creative entrepreneurs in general. I think we all create something because we see
Hmm.
a way to really impact the world positively, and we want to put our creation, there's a deep desire to put our creation out there. Otherwise we wouldn't put in all this effort and work and love to it, right? So
Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned that, because I feel like, yeah, because it is tough being an entrepreneur and it's tough being a creative sometimes, right? Like it's helpful to have like a coach like by your side to help you, because I think especially like creatives, like it, because a lot of your value is kind of impacted depending on what others think of your work a lot of times.
mm,
So it's hard to not really be affected by like criticism or by how people judge our, you know what I mean? So I feel like because of that, there's a lot of value and work, and especially with entrepreneurs, there's a lot of value that's placed on like, okay, well, what did you create? Like, what companies did you create? It's like all about, it's more like tangible, right?
mm.
So that's interesting.
Yeah, I think always having like a support system is so important. The people that you surround yourself with,
Yeah.
who really want to be there and stand for you in the way that you say that you want.
Mm.
And obviously, I can rave about coaching all day, every day, and how a coach does do that. Is one of the probably few people who do just that, like stand for what you want, what you say you want. But I think in general, having a community around you is so important.
Yeah, so actually that's a good point. How about we both say like, what's one or two things that more recently that your coach has helped you hold you accountable to, that maybe it's like something that's tough, but because you
Mm.
have a coach, like you're able to achieve that thing.
So personally, my coach,
Yeah, yeah.
I have to think about this one. Um, this idea of everything being okay. I think my coach works with me on it consistently, because I always bring it up. I bring up judgments. I bring up things, right, that happen. And I know she's not judging me at all. In fact, she's giving me the space to vent if I need to, and but also realize that like that's not really what I'm there for when I'm coaching with her. That I don't just need space to vent. I actually want something different in my life, right, than how things are going. And so the idea of like things are okay as is, like I'm allowed to be angry, I'm allowed to have emotion, that sort of thing. Um, and I can still do whatever I want to. Like all of that is allowed for. We've been working on quite consistently recently.
Mm. Yeah, so actually going back to a lot of our earlier points, I do think there's something about accepting what is and just not make
Mm,
bigger. And I can, maybe it's like an ENFP thing, but yeah, sometimes I'm like, oh my God, I'm like totally bombing my job and blah 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 and all this. And they're like, Davidson, you won like the last 5 awards. Like, shut up. Like, don't even like me. And I'm like, oh, but it's like I can't even like what is it's like, hey, like I've won like the last 5 weeks of like the competition, right? But then in my mind, I'm like, oh, I'm not the number, I don't know. Like there's just all these stories, and then instead of like, dude,
mm,
it's fine, and especially with what's going on now, like it took me a while to I think, and Laura Westman helped me realize like, dude, it's okay to like have an off week. Like there's literally a pandemic. There's literally like pandemic going on. Like, don't be so hard on yourself. I'm like, oh yeah, like that's literally what's happening right now. Like, okay,
yeah.
to have like a bad week. So yeah,
And labeling it a bad week, it's like it can be whatever you want. I mean, maybe it can be bad if you want it to be bad and you want to see it as bad, but like it's okay. You can see it as any way you want and you can change that any moment.
yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Jackie. Well, I didn't expect us to go this deep, but it's certainly refreshing. I think we should all like think about like just honestly, like I do think like a lot of times like it's hard for us to just be in process, right? I think we're always rushing to a destination or a goal, and then sometimes we kind of don't kind of just take like a step and or take a breath and just like, all right, like it's okay, like I'm fine where it is, and then to your point, like respecting the whole process instead of like going through it and then before you know it, like we're like 80 and we're like, what just happened? you know,
Yeah.
it's that's deep.
Well, thank you for providing the space for me to get deep. Like, obviously, we're very familiar with each other, so I feel very, very comfortable to just completely open up, and go there and tell like whatever my truth is, because it was hard at times, right, and stuff, and I could hide that and just be like, oh, we don't have to look at any of those things, and let me just tell you as a coach like what I know and stuff.
Yeah,
But we're
totally.
all human and we all struggle in some ways. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from it if we want to and when we're ready for it and stuff. So, um, anyways, thank you so much, Davidson, for this podcast interview. It's been really lovely.
Thank you. And I do that's a good point because do think like as a coach, like you're leading the way, like you're the example of vulnerability and creating the space for all your clients and everyone in your communities, right? So if you're open to it and you're sharing something clearly that's like very deep and like intimate and personal to you, then that gives everyone else the space. It's like, oh, okay, like it's okay to kind of talk about like our inner like dialogue, right? Because like a lot of us, all of us have these like judgments, and none of us is perfect. So it's good to kind of talk about like some of your realities, because I think sometimes people look at like coaches or people, like people who, and then they see this like almost like perfection, or they think like, oh, like, they were always brilliant, but that's not always the case, or that clearly, like, that's not really, there's so many layers to it. So, but yeah, Jackie, I want to acknowledge you for just like creating space and for the light for your communities and your being. And I mean, honestly, like, you're like not even technically my coach or anything, but even like our conversations have, like, I've had so much progress just in your presence and your support and just like your kind, compassionate being. So thank you so much for like our friendship. And honestly, like, I was like really sad like when you told me, like, I actually couldn't sleep for like a couple of days. So like, I'm glad that you're fine. And yeah, I'm happy that you're back to transforming lives and all that good stuff.
Thank you so much, Davidson. I'm like getting really teary. I feel very touched by what you just said. And I believe that about you too. Um, you're part of my community, and I'm so grateful that you choose to be part of my community as well, that we choose to be in each other's lives. So thank you.
Yes, it's a choice. It's a choice.
Mhm.
Everything is a choice. It's like something that we all have to remember. Thanks, Jackie. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.